So this part is going to be about the player manager, player class, and all the other objects associated with player, like the blasters, mushroom field, stuff like that. So just to start off, this is the player manager itself. I did make it a singleton. Um, so here's the pointer instance. Whenever any of its static functions get called, the singleton will get created, and then when it does get terminated, the pointer instance does get deleted and set to null. So the player manager, its main functions is that it'll create the player, it'll switch the player depending on what game modes it's in. It also creates and starts the AI for the attractor mode. It'll give access to player data like the score, lives, what wave they're on, and and also sets up different pointers for like the player, anything else that uh, needs to get their pointer set up. So this is the central manager. So the first thing that the player manager does, it'll create an AI for the attractor mode, and that would be right here. So it'll if this disable is for the controller, that is if you're in one player, two player mode, they'll turn off that controller and then it'll set it to the AI controller, which is actually part of the strategy pattern. So right here I've got the AI controller, keyboard controller, and the pointer controller would be just like whatever controller is being used at the moment. So for the strategy pattern, here's the controller base class, and then here's the keyboard controller that inherits from the controller. Then here is the AI controller that also inherits from controller. And so yeah, go back to the create AI. So it'll set the current controller to the AI. It'll create the AI player. It'll set up the controller to the blaster that's associated with the AI. And then the current player gets set to the AI, its field. It just sets up all the pointers. And then the next thing it'll do is start the AI, and that just means it'll turn on this or turn off the sound if it needs to. It sets up the this is all just setting up the pointers, and then in the player AI gets initialized. That would be in the player class itself, where it sets up its mushroom field. It gets a blaster. It sets the controller to that blaster, and it also turns on the controller, and a life gets taken away since this is what it's used. So when the player respawns, like a life gets taken away, it's because they got a new life. I'll just show with the mushroom field what it's like when it gets initialized. I'll go a little more into it in that part, but just it, there is I've got a vector of mushroom positions, and it just goes through the vector and places the mushrooms on the mushroom field. Basically, just spawns them in. Um, then other than that, so that would be for the AI, and then it'll just set the wave manager to get the field for the AI. So when one player, two player mode gets set up, it'll turn off the AI, which would be right here. So it just deinitializes, and then the player class, it just deinitializes the field, which pretty much just gets rid of the field. So it removes all the mushrooms, but saves the position of the mushrooms. Um, it'll turn off the controller, and then it'll destroy the blaster associated with that player. And then the next thing that happens is it creates a new player, and in this case it's one player mode. So in the create player, which would be right here, turns off any controller that's on. It'll set the controller to the keyboard controller. If there isn't a player one yet, it'll create that player. Um, It'll set all the pointers to the right spot. It'll set the pointers point to the right objects, and that's all that does. But if it gets called again for two-player mode, it creates two players. So it's basically just the same thing, except it'll create the player two, but it won't set up any of the pointers to player two yet, since player one goes first. And let's see. So for the switch player, this is the biggest function just because there's so many conditions for it. Um, I didn't get to make the function smaller, or break it off into separate functions, but this is just what I have. So the wave will end. It checks if it's in attractor mode. If it is, it'll just respawn the player, and respawning the player would be right here. All it is just sets up the mushroom field again, sets the blasters, or sets the controllers to the blasters and turns them on. And go back up. So this is if you're in one player mode, all of this, you run out of lives, it'll end the game. It does everything that it needs to do to end the game. It'll create a new AI player, start the AI. Otherwise, it'll respawn the player since it doesn't have to switch. It's in one player mode. If it is in two player mode, though, there's a check for if both players run out of lives. There is a check to see if it's player one playing. It'll check to see if player two has lives. It'll switch. Same thing goes if it's player two and player one has lives. It'll switch. If the other player is out of lives, it'll just respawn the player like normal, and it'll just set more pointers right here and start the next wave. And this is for the player manager. Or for the player when they get score, it'll add the score to the current player. And then this is what I did because for every 12,000 points, the player gets a new life. So this is what I did to get that working. I get the player's current score, and I check to see if it is greater than a multiple of the score bonus, in this case 12,000. And if it is, the player will obviously get a new life, and then it'll uh, get the current multiplier for the bonus. It'll change it right here. Excuse me. And then if then these are just some conditions where if it's in player one, it'll change its score in lives, and if it's in player two, it'll change or update their score in lives. And then these are just a lot of gets and sets, or not sets, but a lot of gets for the other classes that I have, and then just something to increase the wave for the player. And I believe that would be, oh yeah, here's some sets right here. But I believe that's it for the player manager. As for the player class itself, this is what I have. Just holds all the data for the player, score, lives, the wave, the mushroom field, the controller, the blaster, the grid. Um, then there's some sets and some functions just to modify like the score and the lives. And so for the player, when it gets created, it gets a new grid, a new mushroom field, and it'll set that grid to the mushroom field. So, and then here's the player initialize. I already went through this, but field gets started up, blaster gets created, controller gets set to the blaster. Uh, so yeah, here when the player gets to a new wave, it'll set its wave value to the right wave, and then some gets. And here's where the player would actually get their score. And then when the player dies, the blaster factory actually gets called for the sound. That would be. So when the player dies, the blaster factory gets called for right. Oh, that's the bullet. Go. Blaster factory. So when the player dies, the sound or the explosion sound gets played. Controller turns off, blaster The pointer for the blaster gets set to 0, and the player manager will switch players. And that is it for the player class. Let's see. Yep, that would be it for the player class.